Before I get into the meat of my book, I thought I'd start off by saying some words about the current situation of Indigenous politics in Australia. As comrades will be probably aware, there's quite a few things going on at the moment. So on October 14, there's going to be a referendum in Australia to decide if an Indigenous voice to Parliament should be included in the Constitution. And the referendum has become a topic of heated debate in Australian politics. The Liberals and the Nationals, which are the two main conservative parties in Australia, as well as the far-right party One Nation, are campaigning hard for a no vote and are using very vitriolic racist rhetoric to back this up. Meanwhile, the federal Labor government, most kind of well-known Indigenous figures, the Business Council of Australia, trade unions and NGOs are campaigning for a yes vote. And the Yes campaign argues that the Voice, which will be a kind of body of Indigenous representatives that advises the Australian government, will help Indigenous people overcome disadvantage and discrimination. Now, over the last 6 months, support for the Voice has dramatically declined. So to give you an idea, at the end of last year, it was 65 towards 70%. And as you can see with the chart, it's really collapsed by an enormous amount to less than 50% now. And there was a poll just yesterday saying it might be as low as 35% of people who vote for the Voice on October 14. And in order to get the referendum to pass, you need not just an overall majority, but a majority in a majority of states as well. And some states, like in the US, are more conservative and right-wing than others. So Western Australia and Queensland are definitely going to vote no. So it's another hurdle for it to come across. You'll need more than 51%, to actually get the referendum to succeed. The proposal for a Voice was developed by a layer of Indigenous academics and lawyers and was endorsed by hundreds of delegates at the First Nations National Constitutional Convention in 2017. And this convention argued that the Voice should be enshrined in a constitution through a referendum in order to make it more difficult for hostile governments to dissolve it, which is something which has happened to previous Aboriginal advisory bodies in the kind of 80s and 90s and 2000s. And when the Labor government won the 2022 federal election, they quickly announced that a referendum on the Voice would be a big part of the new government's agenda. And for Labor, it was really about, presenting a kind of progressive gloss to their pretty right-wing government. They thought, this will be a thing that everyone will support. It'll be really nice. People support Aboriginal people, give a big boost to the government. Big businesses on board with it as well. This, will be a slam dunk. Now, the Voice itself is a very modest proposal. It will only be an advisory body, so it'll have no actual power over government policy. They'll write reports and have meetings with government officials, but the Parliament can totally ignore whatever they want. And it kind of ignores the fact that the reality is that the political parties in the government know very well what is wrong in Indigenous communities, how they're oppressed by racism and discrimination, and they don't do anything about it at the moment. So there's very little hope that just some more advice will change that. And this is even more limited than equivalent systems in other countries, such as New Zealand and Canada, which also have representative systems for First Nations peoples. However, even such a powerless advisory body has attracted really fierce opposition from the right wing of Australian society. So you probably won't know who these people are, but the guy looks kind of like Voldemort there. That is Peter Dutton. He's the leader of the Liberal Party. Before he was a politician, he was a cop in Queensland. He has very cop kind of vibes going on. He's a very hard right politician. And standing next to him is Jacinta Price. She is an Aboriginal woman, but a very right-wing Aboriginal woman from a kind of conservative political family who have been campaigning for years for all sorts of kind of pretty racist and right-wing positions, and is a darling for the right because she's Aboriginal. So they think, this is really fantastic to kind of own the left or whatever. Now, the conservative right views a defeat for the Voice as a chance to strike a devastating blow against support for Indigenous rights amongst the Australian population, and they hope in the process to undermine public support for the Labor government. And in the process, they're reviving every racist myth in the playbook. They argue that Indigenous people shouldn't get special treatment, so-called, that opposing racism is actually dividing the nation, and that the Voice would undermine democracy. Jacinta Price, who's been promoted to the shadow cabinet, has really shot to media stardom. gave a very widely publicized speech at the National Press Conference where she ranted about black on black crime. She celebrated the British Empire, and she argued that the colonisation of Australia had only a positive impact on Indigenous people because it gave them running water and housing. The Liberal leader Peter Dutton claims that the Voice will re-racialise Australian society, and echoing Donald Trump's kind of attempt to steal the election, Dutton also says that the Australian Electoral Commission could be plotting to rig the referendum to undermine the no vote. Sky News Australia has launched a 24-hour channel that's just about the Voice. They poured a lot of kind of money into, and just like has the latest conspiracy theory kind of things that they promote. There was the recent Australian Conservative Political Action Conference, modelled on the US one, which was just filled with racist tirades. The main kind of thing was all about the Voice, probably epitomised by this comedian called Rodney Marks, where he got a thunderous applause when he opened the conference by saying, "I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, violent black men." And this was defended by like all the right-wing politicians. It's a really funny joke. And conservative political strategists in Australia argue that if the no vote wins, it could be like Australia's Brexit moment or like the 2016 election of Donald Trump. That's how they kind of see it. Like this will expose that actually in the mass of the population really right-wing and back up the Liberal Party and reject the left. So that's what they're trying to kind of do with it. And the right has used the bigoted atmosphere around the debate over the Voice to promote a series of racist attacks on Indigenous rights beyond just the Voice itself. So in Western Australia, the Labor government there adopted a pretty kind of mild cultural heritage bill in July, which is about trying to defend culturally significant sites for Indigenous people. And this led to a massive right-wing backlash with like many very large protests organised mainly by farmers, but then it was backed by the Liberal Party, the Nationals, and then by the Murdoch media as well. And the right connected this act to the Voice, and they claimed that if the Voice was passed, this will give Aboriginal people all across Australia the right to enter anyone's home and to stop them from constructing anything and to have the passwords to their computers and just like all sorts of other totally crazy stuff that was not like rejected in the media. It was just reported on as well. This is what people are saying. Who knows? Maybe it's true. In response to this, the Labor government overturned the Heritage Act, so they backed down, just totally capitulated to this campaign by the right. There's also been a really hysterical moral panic about Indigenous youth crime, particularly in the Northern Territory and in Queensland. And this has been amplified by conservative media outlets and politicians across the country. And in response, the Queensland Labor government has changed the law to make it illegal for people as young as 10 to breach their bail conditions. So if you're like a 10-year-old kid and you don't turn up to your court date or whatever, they can just like send you straight to jail in response to this. So really disgusting. And they've recently suspended the Human Rights Act to allow the police to put people who are under 18 into adult prisons because the youth prisons are filled with too many people. So they now want to expand it into the adult ones. And Queensland has the largest youth prison population in Australia, 63% of which are Aboriginal. For left-wing people in Australia, this intensification of racism has come as quite a shock. I think it's important to understand, like, lots of racist stuff happen in lots of countries all the time, but this is quite a shock for people. For the last decade or so, it seemed that support for Indigenous rights, while still inadequate, was at least moving in the right direction, that progress was being made. We had tens of thousands of people coming to the Invasion Day rallies. The issues of police brutality and racism were at the centre of mainstream political discussion, and there was a greater appreciation of the history of Indigenous oppression. And the kind of right-wing parties were thrown onto the back foot about Aboriginal rights. Like they didn't really go on the attack about it for the last 5 to 10 years or so, because they could recognise there was more popular support for these issues. The question which arises out of this, I guess, is like, how has the right so successfully undermined this support? Why is every major poll showing the Voice dropping to such low levels of support in the population? And part of the explanation, I think, is that there definitely is a bedrock of racist attitudes amongst a not insignificant section of the Australian population, for sure. And these attitudes didn't come from nowhere. They were pushed from the top of society. For more than 150 years, the Australian establishment ridiculed Aboriginal people as biologically inferior. They subjugated subjected them to horrendous cruelties, the frontier massacres, economic exploitation, the removal of children, and racist segregation. And this has left definitely a racist residue in Australian society, which right-wing politicians and tap in and mobilise for their own kind of electoral and populist reasons. And while there have been important shifts in popular attitudes over recent decades, an old school kind of open hostility to Aboriginal people is still relatively marginal, and racist attitudes endure in various forms. So greater numbers of young people might support changing the date of Australia Day, be concerned about black deaths in custody, and if anything, think the Voice is kind of too modest and too crap. Not that it's like some super radical thing, but it's a different story of other sections of the population. And the biggest supporters of the No campaign are people who are 55 and over, which is a big section of the population, for better or worse. Now, not everyone supporting a no vote is like a hardcore racist necessarily. There's also a significant section of the population who just like don't care very much about Indigenous people and have much of an understanding about it. And while they're not the kind of people who would oppose some of the shifts towards greater cultural recognition or acknowledgements and welcome to countries, things like that, they also don't have any defense against the more coded arguments presented by the No campaign. And so there's kind of the openly racist section of the No campaign, but there's another section who just say kind of more, again, coded versions of it. They just say, oh, isn't the proposal really confusing? Aren't there some Aboriginal people who oppose the Voice? So, that shows maybe you should oppose it as well. Won't it cost a lot of money is another kind of arguments raised, which does connect with some people because of the cost of living crisis. And so the main slogan used by the No campaign is, if you don't know, vote no. That's kind of like the thing they're pushing. And all of this, I think, does point to the shallowness of the shift around Indigenous issues in the last decade or so, which occurred without any serious radicalization in society or even sustained mass activism that could have significantly transformed popular attitudes on this issue in a deeper way. While there's been the occasional large protests in Australia, we've not had the same kind of mass scale anti-racist protests that you guys had during Black Lives Matter, for instance. That has not happened in Australia. And Indigenous people are a very marginalised section of Australian society and very oppressed. They only make up around 3% of the population. A lot of them live in very poor remote communities or in very poor urban areas. And many, non-Indigenous Australians will go through their whole life without ever meeting an Aboriginal person, or having any interaction with them on any level whatsoever. And so it can be hard to build, solidarity in that situation. So a win for the no vote in the referendum will embolden the racist right, which is already scoring some victories against Indigenous rights, as I was saying. And that's why, despite our criticisms of the Voice and the Yes campaign, Socialist Alternative are arguing that the left should vote yes in the upcoming referendum. However, what happens on October 14, we will need to keep fighting against anti-Indigenous racism. We can't just throw up our hands if the No campaign pulls off a win. To do so would simply deepen the demoralisation that both Indigenous and anti-racist non-Indigenous people will undoubtedly feel. And if the Voice does manage to get over the line, then there's still a lot of racism in society that we're going to have to keep fighting against. It's not going to do much to overturn that. But rather than just sinking into despair, we can look at the long history of anti-racist campaigns in Australia for some clues for how we can build resistance to racism even in these difficult times. And this brings me to my book, Indigenous Liberation, Socialism, which documents the history of many of these struggles. Indeed. One of the goals of my book is to highlight the often ignored story of how the struggles of Aboriginal people have overlapped with the socialist movement throughout the history of Australia. And this is a really rich history that traditional academic research has either dismissed or significantly downplayed. To take just one example, when I started researching into the history of the militant shearers in the late 1800s, which were a very left-wing union in Australia, and they had a whole bunch of general strikes in kind of the 1890s, I was investigating to see whether Aboriginal workers were involved in this, because it happened in rural areas. It's where most Aboriginal people were. That would be interesting if that was the case. And I found endless articles, PhD theses that people had worked on for like 5-10 years sometimes, whole books that argued, first of all, that there had been no Aboriginal shearers. That's something which I came across all the time. And it took me like 10 minutes to find this photo with Aboriginal shearers in it, which shows you how much good some PhD theses are sometimes. And even those who did admit that there'd been some Aboriginal people as shearers, they said, they definitely wouldn't have been members of trade unions because of the racism at the time. However, an examination of the publications and records of the shearers' unions quickly revealed that there had been hundreds of Aboriginal members involved, and that some had played relatively leading roles. So a guy called Andrew Stewart Septney, who was an Aboriginal shearer, was the leader of a strike camp in Cobar, which is in rural New South Wales, during the 1894 shearers' strike, and he led dozens of horse-bound shearers into battle with the police and scabbing workers. And he was so successful as a strike leader that the union leaders actually asked him to move up to Queensland to lead the struggle in one of the main stations there in Bowen Downs. Another example is the enthusiastic participation of Aboriginal shearers in strikes in Western New South Wales in 1902. And this caused one trade union leader to write, "The knockout to the boss was the unanimous roll-up of the Aboriginal workers, who are staunch unionists and deserve our assistance in other ways. The reality is, if the whites had been as true as to their fellows as the darkskins, New South Wales would be union today." And these interconnections between the workers' movement and Indigenous people were deepened by the activities of the Communist Party of Australia. In 1931, the Communist Party published its first major writing on Aboriginal issues, the Communist Party's Fight for Aborigines, a draft program of struggle against slavery. And you can hopefully see it there. It's not scanned very well in the archives, unfortunately, but gives you an idea. And this draft program is like really radical for 1931. Like it begins with a whole thing about the invasion of Australia, how racist it was, how it destroyed Aboriginal people, how we rejected it, the whole history of exploitation, of the frontier massacres and so forth. Then it presents a long list of demands for full economic, social, and political rights, for the abolition of the Aborigines Protection Boards. It says that all Aboriginal prisoners should be released from jail because you can't say that any of their trials are unbiased because of the racism at the time. And instead, they should be retried by all Aboriginal juries. So very radical and advanced demands in the 1930s. And these weren't just words. The communists tried to put their anti-racist ideas into practice. One of the first places they did so was in the 1930s in Darwin, which is in the Northern Territory. People know the north of Australia. It's a port city. At the time, the Great Depression was in full swing, and communist activists established a local branch of the unemployed workers movement to fight for the rights of unemployed workers. And as a part of this, they also took up the demands of unemployed Aboriginal people, who often were paid no dole at all or at a significantly lower rate than white workers. And this is a photo from one of the protests at the time. It's a really interesting photo because it's like a very multicultural, I guess, protest. So there's like some Chinese guys who are sitting down on the ground, like the guy with the hat and the pipe there. There's a number of like Malaysian and Indonesian workers, and there's some Aboriginal workers as well. So there's this guy who's kind of leaning against the pole that flag is on. That's actually a red flag. You can't tell because of the colouring, but they climbed onto the roof of this building, which is like the local unemployment office, and like waved the red flag, and police had to come up and drag them off. But the guy is leaning against the pole is Joe McGuinness, and he would go on to become a very famous Aboriginal activist in the post-war years and would become the first Aboriginal president of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, which is kind of the main civil rights organisation in Australia. And this is the first protest he was involved in. In 1932, the Darwin Communists also took up a campaign against the organisation of a police operation into Armand Land, which is close to Darwin, which they believed would end in a massacre of Aboriginal people. And they were joined by communists and left-wing activists across the country, organised meetings and protests, including a 2,000-strong rally in Sydney in 1934, which is pretty amazing for that kind of period. And this solidarity continued into the post-war era, of what is one of the most famous examples of left-wing support for Aboriginal struggles, the Pilbara Strike of 1946. And these are some photos from the strikers and also some of the newspapers at the time. And this strike involved hundreds of Aboriginal workers walking off stations on May Day, actually, the 1st of May 1946, in protest against decades of racism and exploitation. And while the strike was led by the Aboriginal workers themselves, a white communist by the name of Don McLeod played a key role in advising and helping to organize the strike. Eventually, the Pilbara strike was able to win after 3 years of defiance when the left-wing Seamen's Union introduced a ban on all wool exports in Western Australia, which forced the station owners to the negotiating table. Despite the Cold War atmosphere, it was during the 1950s that support for Aboriginal rights became cemented as a part of the common sense of the left wing of the workers' movement in Australia. An important role was played by 4 of the main left-wing unions at the time: the Waterside Workers' Federation, the WARPIes, the Building Workers Industrial Union, the Sheet Metal Workers Union, and the Seamen's Union. And in my research, it was very rare for a state or federal conference of the left unions to go by without mention of support for Aboriginal workers. And this is a photo from a protest of the wharf workers campaigning for Aboriginal rights in the 50s. So as this brief survey shows, the socialist left made an important contribution to the struggle for Aboriginal rights in Australia. The role that the Communist Party in particular played within these movements, though, raises a whole series of political issues and problems, particularly for those of us who are coming at this history from a socialist but an anti-Stalinist socialist perspective. As socialists want to defend the contributions of the left and the workers' movement to struggles around racism and other issues, absolutely, from those who want to kind of dismiss that history. But as that anti-Stalinists, we also want to combine that with a critical assessment of how the Stalinist politics of the Communist Party negatively impacted, how it impacted into different struggles, including those for Aboriginal rights. And this is another major theme of my book. Now, sometimes the issue here was very direct and obvious. So often the Communist Party would have, an article or a public meeting where they'll denounce the latest racist horror that the Australian government was doing to Aboriginal people. Totally correct. And then they'll end that by saying, and this compares to the USSR, where, people are treated really well there. There's a lot of equality, all the national minorities, Stalin really loves them, gives them full equal rights, the right to independence or whatever. The problem of this, of course, is it definitely was not true. Stalin and his successors brutally cracked down on any serious moves for national autonomy or rights within the old Soviet Union. But the problems go deeper than just the Communist Party's support for an authoritarian dictatorship. From the mid-1930s onwards, and particularly in the post-war years, the communists turned towards reptimism in practice, even while they kept much of the rhetoric of the Marxist movement. They embedded themselves within the left wing of the ALP and the trade union bureaucracy, and they argued that until the influence of US imperialism over Australia was defeated by a popular front of workers, the middle class, and progressive capitalists, never seen them, but there you go, the struggle for socialism and liberation couldn't advance. And this led to all sorts of general problems with the issue of the Popular Front, people might know about, as well as problems on Aboriginal issues more narrowly. So, for instance, the campaigns for Aboriginal rights that communists were involved in during the 1950s were pretty politically moderate and cautious, as activists sought to maintain a respectable image in the conservative atmosphere of the Cold War. Petitions, the usual form of activity, and the key focus was on trying to get the United Nations to intervene into Australia and get them to stop, oppressing Aboriginal people. Or they looked towards, Labor politicians or even right-wing politicians who said that they supported Aboriginal rights as the main kind of focus of activity. And when protests did occur, they usually took the form of, silent vigils in contrast to the more militant style of direct action that would emerge in the late 1960s. At the high point of the Cold War, the problems of this approach were not so obvious and could be dismissed as the only thing possible at the time. However, it stored up problems that came to the fore during the 1960s and 1970s. Now, as most people in the meeting will know, the 60s and early 70s were a period of profound radicalization around the world, and that was the case in Australia as well. University students took to the streets and occupied their campuses in protests against the Vietnam War. In the United States, there was a powerful struggle for civil rights, which mobilized huge numbers and inspired struggles against racism internationally. And united movements of students and workers erupted in France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and many other countries. And Australia was not immune to this upheaval. Here too, hundreds of thousands marched against the war. The confidence of the working class to take industrial action surged forwards, and a new radical left emerged, critical of the conservatism and moderation of both the Labor Party and the old Communist Party. And it was in this context that significant radicalization in the movement for Indigenous rights took place. which saw the coming together of a number of new rebellious elements which imbued the fight for Indigenous rights with a more radical spirit. So first of all, we have the student movement, which erupted. So this is a photo from a protest organised by Sydney University students, which is kind of one of the main left-wing campuses at the time. And this is in support of the Gurindji land rights struggle, which began in 1966. So what they're doing is Vesties, which is like the British company that owned the lands that the Aboriginal workers were campaigning to get back. They're like a big kind of meat producer, and so they would go into like shopping centers and have these big rallies and get everyone to like throw the meat on the ground and refuse to buy it and like protest against Vesty. And unlike the campaigners in the 1950s, these students engaged in tactics, more direct actiony. They marched on the street, they clashed with the police, they occupied the foyers of office buildings, and in this picture, protested inside supermarkets. And in the next photo, you can see them getting dragged out by the police. It wasn't just students, of course, who were impacted by the shift to the left in society. There was also a new generation of younger, more militant Aboriginal activists who were increasingly drawn to the politics of the Black Power movement in the United States. So in this next photo, this is a rally organised by Black Power activists in Redfern. The guy who's got kind of the kid on his shoulders there marching a banner is Paul Coe. He was a very famous Black Power activist in the 60s and 70s in Redfern in Sydney. And unlike previous generations of Aboriginal activists, the supporters of Black Power were much more confrontational, again, willing to kind of stand up to the police, march on the streets, have protests against them, and stand their ground. And in this next picture, you can actually see, anyway, some of the tensions this caused. So that's Paul Coe there with like the megaphone kind of thing, and the cop next to him is obviously some psycho racist who wants to beat his head in by the look on his smug face. So we've got the students, we've got the Black Power activists. Then the third element in this picture was the radicalization amongst the working class. And this really took off after the arrest of trade union leader Clary O'Shea in 1969. And this led to a week in which there were like 3 or 4 general strikes all across Australia. And like hundreds of thousands of people were involved in this. So this is a photo from the strike rally in Sydney. And this was just like a total watershed moment in Australian kind of working class politics. And it led to a huge increase in strikes all across the country, metal workers, builders, labourers, wharfies, etc., miners. And this industrial militancy also fed into opposition around political issues. So trade unions were a big part of the anti-Vietnam War campaign in Australia. By some amounts, they made up 50 to 60 moratorium rallies that happened. And one of the main slogans of those rallies was "Stop work to stop the war," kind of reflective of that influence of the workers' movement in that campaign. But that also took strike action around equal pay for women and, of course, around Aboriginal rights as well. And one of the best examples of this was probably the Builders Labourers Federation, or the BLF, which was a left-wing union of construction workers that used its industrial power during the building boom of the 60s to take strike action around broader social issues, including land rights and in support of the Black Power movement in Redfern. An event which saw these kind of different elements, the students of Black Power activists and radicalising workers kind of coming together, occurred in July 1972 in a protest called the Moratorium for Black Rights, named after the Vietnam moratoriums. And this is organised by Black Power activists in Redfern who look to mobilise support from the Allies and the student socialist left and the workers' movement around a very kind of left-wing, radical, anti-racist platform. And this protest was really cool. It started at Sydney University. The guy there in the kind of leather jacket and the bandana is Gary Foley. He's a very famous left Black Power activist in Australia, still speaks at our Marxism conferences, been around for a bit. That's all the students kind of getting together for the start of the protest. Then they march through the streets, etc. One of the problems they had, which happens a lot in Sydney, that's where I live as well, is that the police originally said they could march on the roads, and the last minute decided actually they're not allowed to march on the roads. So this is what this cop is doing, is like telling them all to get off the road. And people wouldn't get off the roads, and they mobilized a huge number of police to just like shove everyone onto the sidewalk to stop them from hurting the poor street with the soles of their shoes. And it led to some argy-bargy. So this is like one of the Black Power activists getting thrown into the paddy wagon and arrested. during the demonstration. But when they reached Redfern Park, they were joined by a huge contingent of builders, labourers, and other trade unionists, and the rally swelled to about 5 to 6,000 people, and they marched towards Town Hall. And you can see that banner at the back there is builders, labourers support black rights from the contingent of trade union people. That's like this sort of little banner, and this is a really nice photo, one of my kind of favorite from the day. I think captures the joy and determination of the protesters, land rights now, the Aboriginal flags, the black balloons, and so forth. Now, the coming together of the student left, the black power activists, and the left wing of the workers' movement in the 70s was important because it revealed that the limitations of the old Stalinist left didn't have to mean junking the whole idea that the working class was the agent of social change, although it did mean that the socialist left would have to clarify what this meant. People often think that if you want a movement with mass support, then it has to be really moderate because it's the only way in which you can get large numbers of people involved. Or they think, if you want a really radical movement, then it has to be really, really tiny because it's the only way you can get people to agree with really extreme methods or something. It could only be a small minority. But the radicalization 60s and 70s offers us a glimpse into an alternative framework for bringing together the movement for socialism and the struggle for Aboriginal liberation on the basis of mass struggle and an appreciation of the power of workers in particular around a very bold and anti-racist platform. And the relevance of this for today is that we're currently in a really difficult situation regarding the struggle for Indigenous rights in Australia, as I discussed at the beginning. Cops continue to murder Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Land rights are trodden on to dig up fossil fuels. The Liberal Party is running this vile racist campaign against Aboriginal people, while all the Labor Party offers is symbolic recognition without substantial change. And history, of course, doesn't simply repeat itself, but by looking at how the movements for socialism and Indigenous rights have intersected in the past, I think we can creatively think about how they can be rebuilt and flourish in the future. And that's the hope on which this book is based. So hope you've enjoyed the talk. And if you're able to get a copy of the book, you can learn more about it.